My name is Arthur Vance, and the day my life changed for good, I was standing in the musty town clerk's office, feeling the burn of shame creep up my neck. My own brother-in-law, Mark, clapped me on the shoulder, his voice booming so everyone could hear. "Congratulations, Arthur," he said, a smug grin plastered on his face. "You're officially the proud captain of the biggest rust bucket on the eastern seaboard." He was talking about the old scrapyard, the only thing my late wife's grandfather had left to his name. Mark just kept going, his words like little daggers. "They laughed when the old man dragged that submarine ashore 50 years ago, and they're laughing at you now. Enjoy your pile of tetanus." I just stood there, clutching the deed. That piece of paper felt heavier than any engine block I'd ever lifted. What would you do if your own family laughed in your face for honoring a memory? Listen to my story until the end, and tell me, what would you have done in my place? Also, let me know from which city you're listening. I need to know I'm not alone in this. If you want to hear more stories like this one, subscribe to the channel. The property itself was a local joke. A few acres of forgotten coastline, choked with weeds and dominated by the skeletal remains of a beached submarine that had been rotting there for half a century. Eleanor's grandfather, a man her family had written off as a crackpot, had bought it for a song after the war. For them, it was an eyesore, a testament to his foolishness. But for me, it was the last piece of Eleanor I had left. She used to tell me stories about playing near the Iron Whale as a little girl, before the family feud that tore them all apart. Her family saw a heap of scrap metal. I saw the last echo of her childhood. Taking it wasn't about the land or the rust. It was a promise I was making to her memory, a way of telling her that I hadn't forgotten the parts of her that even her own blood had tried to bury. It was my duty to claim it, no matter how much of a fool it made me look. Mark and his wife Susan were there for one reason, to watch me fail. They'd spent months with their lawyers trying to get that will overturned. They didn't see a scrapyard. They saw prime waterfront real estate for their next luxury condo project. When the judge sided with the will, their politeness vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp contempt that filled that little office. Mark's condescending pat on my shoulder was for show, a performance for the clerk and the other person waiting in line. He wanted public humiliation. As I turned to leave, without saying a word back to him, I heard Susan let out a soft, sharp snicker. It was quiet, almost ladylike, but it cut deeper than all of Mark's loud-mouthed insults. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated scorn, the final confirmation that, in their eyes, I was nothing more than an old fool inheriting a pile of garbage. They thought they had already won the war of perception. Walking out of that building and into the cold Port Blossom air, I felt 100 pairs of eyes on my back, even though the street was mostly empty. I could feel the clerk's pity, the stranger's curiosity, Mark and Susan's triumphant glares burning into me. I just kept my head down, my hands stuffed in my jacket pocket, gripping the folded deed so hard my knuckles turned white. It wasn't anger I felt, not yet. It was something colder, heavier. It was the weight of being underestimated your entire life, a feeling I knew all too well. I'd spent 40 years as a mechanic, a man of grease and oil, always looked down upon by people like Mark, who dealt in paper and money. They saw my calloused hands and my quiet nature, and assumed I was simple. They assumed I was weak. That day, they made the mistake of saying it out loud, of putting their disdain on public display. And in that quiet moment, a different kind of engine started turning inside me. The thing is, Mark was right about one thing. The town had always laughed at Eleanor's grandfather. They called him the Admiral of the Rust, and told stories about the crazy old man who thought he could make a fortune from a beached U-boat. He became a local legend for all the wrong reasons. Now, that legacy of ridicule was mine. By signing that paper, I had willingly put his clown shoes on my own feet. I knew what was coming. I'd be Captain Arthur, the Newtown fool. Every trip to the hardware store, every nod from a neighbor would have a little smirk behind it. They wouldn't see a man honoring his wife. They'd see a broke, laid-off old mechanic clinging to a fantasy, just like the old man before him. What they didn't know, what Mark could never understand, was that sometimes the most valuable things aren't the ones that shine. Sometimes they're the ones buried under 50 years of rust and ridicule. My life didn't start with much. I was born right here in Port Blossom, back when the shipyard still hummed, and you could smell the salt and diesel in the air from miles away. My father was a fisherman, his hands permanently cracked and stained from the nets in the cold Atlantic water. He taught me that you don't complain. You just work until the job is done. We lived in a small house that leaned a little to the left, and every winter the wind would find its way through the window frames, no matter how many rags we stuffed in them. We weren't poor, not in spirit, but money was always a guest who never stayed for long. It was a simple life, built on the idea that your worth was measured by the sweat on your brow and the honesty in your heart, not the dollars in your pocket. I watched this town change. The big shipyards closed down one by one, their skeletons left to rust by the water's edge. The fishing boats became fewer, replaced by pleasure yachts for rich folks from out of state. A lot of good men I grew up with left, looking for work elsewhere. But I stayed. This was my home. I wasn't cut out for the sea like my dad. My talent was with engines. I found my calling in the grease and grime of the Port Blossom garage. I could listen to an engine and hear its story, diagnose its sickness just by the rhythm of its cough or the pitch of its whine. It was a language I understood better than words. People like Mark, they see a man with dirty hands, and they think he's got a dirty, simple mind. They don't understand the precision, the patience, the deep satisfaction of bringing something broken back to life. For over 40 years, that garage was my world. I started as a kid sweeping floors and fetching tools, and I ended up as the master mechanic, the one they called when the new computer diagnostics couldn't figure it out. I rebuilt transmissions that were written off as scrap, coaxed life back into engines that had been silent for a decade. My hands, they're a map of my life. Every scar, every callus, every permanently stained fingernail is a testament to a problem solved, a promise kept. I took pride in that. When a person hands you the keys to their only way to get to work, they're trusting you with their livelihood. I never took that trust for granted. It was my own small way of holding the world together, one bolt at a time. Then, about a year ago, some big corporation bought the garage. They came in with their shiny suits and their clipboards, talking about efficiency and streamlining. They replaced me with a younger guy who knew how to plug in a computer but couldn't tell you the difference between a carburetor and a fuel injector by feel. They said I was too old and slow for modern diagnostics. Just like that, 40 years of my life were packed into a cardboard box. They gave me a small pension that barely covers the bills and a pat on the back. I went from being the man everyone in town trusted with their car to just another old-timer sitting on his porch, watching the world speed by without him. It was a different kind of humiliation, a quiet one that gnawed at you in the dead of night. But the best part of my life, the part that made all the hard work worth it, was Eleanor. I met her at a town dance. She was standing by the punch bowl, looking like she didn't belong, and I guess I didn't either. Her family had a little more than mine. They weren't rich like Mark's people, but they were a step up. They looked at me, a mechanic's apprentice with grease under his nails, and they saw someone who wasn't good enough for their daughter. But Eleanor, she saw something else. She saw the way my eyes lit up when I talked about engines. She saw the honesty my father had taught me. She didn't care about the grease. She said it was the color of hard work, and she wasn't afraid of it. We got married a year later, in the little church by the harbor. Her family came, but they looked like they were attending a funeral. It didn't matter. All that mattered was the look in her eyes. We bought a small, run-down house on the edge of town, the one I still live in today. The roof leaked, the paint was peeling, and the floorboards groaned with every step. But it was ours. I spent every evening and every weekend fixing it up, piece by piece. Eleanor would be right there beside me, holding the flashlight, handing me nails, painting the walls a cheerful yellow. We didn't have much, but in that little house we were the richest people on earth. I promised her on our wedding day that I'd always protect her and provide for her. I never broke that promise. Eleanor was the one who told me all about her grandfather and the submarine. Her family had cut the old man off long before I came along, ashamed of his eccentricities, but she remembered him from when she was a little girl. She'd tell me stories about how he'd take her down to that stretch of coast before it was completely overgrown. She called the submarine the Iron Whale. To her, it wasn't an eyesore or a pile of junk. It was a magical, mysterious castle rising out of the sand. She said she could feel the stories trapped inside it, secrets of the deep ocean. Her family tried to make her forget him, to erase that part of her history, but she held on to those memories like precious jewels. That scrapyard, that rusted-out submarine, it was the last pure piece of her childhood. The family feud had soured everything else. So when she talked about it, her whole face would light up in a way I rarely saw when she talked about her own parents or her sister Susan. It was her secret garden, a place that belonged only to her, and the memory of a grandfather everyone else called crazy. For me, listening to those stories, the place became sacred. It wasn't just land and metal. It was a monument to the part of my wife that her own family had tried to shame into silence. It was a symbol of her resilience, her ability to see wonder where others only saw waste and failure. Then, 5 years ago, the world went dark. It started with a cough she couldn't shake, a weariness that sleep couldn't fix. The doctors gave it a name: cancer. From that day on, our life became a blur of hospital corridors that smelled of bleach, hushed conversations with doctors who offered carefully worded sympathies, and long nights where I'd just sit by her bed, holding her hand, listening to the beep of the machines. I watched the strongest person I had ever known become fragile, but her spirit never broke. She fought with a quiet dignity that humbled me every single day. She was more worried about me, about what I'd do without her, than she was about herself. I did everything I could. I took every extra shift at the garage, sold the old truck I'd spent years restoring, cashed in our small retirement savings. Every penny we had, every penny I could borrow, went to her treatments. We chased every specialist, every experimental drug, every sliver of hope. Mark and Susan sent a sympathy card. Once. They never visited, never offered a dime. They were probably already circling, thinking about what they could get when it was all over. I didn't care. I would have sold my own soul to give her one more good day, one more morning where she woke up without pain. The money meant nothing. It was just paper. She was my entire world. In the end, it wasn't enough. I spent her last days right there by her side, telling her stories, reminding her of the good times, of fixing up our little house, of that first dance. I made her a promise. I promised I wouldn't let her memory fade. I promised I would remember the girl who saw magic in a rusted submarine, not just the woman that sickness had taken from me. When she was gone, the silence in our little house was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. It was a physical weight, pressing down on me, suffocating me. Going back to work helped. For a while. The familiar routine, the smell of oil and steel, it was an anchor. Then they took that away from me, too. So when the lawyer's letter arrived, telling me about her grandfather's will, it felt like a message from another world. It felt like a sign from her. I knew what Mark and Susan saw: a worthless piece of land, a liability, a joke. But I saw something different. I saw the Iron Whale. I saw the last piece of Eleanor's story that hadn't been tainted or taken away. Claiming it wasn't a choice. It was a duty. It was the fulfillment of that last promise I made to her. It was my way of telling her, and telling the world, that I would not let the thing she cherished be turned into a parking lot for some luxury condo. I would honor her memory, even if it meant becoming the town fool to do it. My hands may be old and calloused, and my back may ache in the morning, but I'm not a simple man. I understand the value of things that can't be bought or sold. I understand loyalty. I understand that sometimes the greatest treasures are buried under layers of rust and ridicule, just waiting for someone with enough patience and love to uncover them. Mark and his kind, they operate on a different frequency. They see land, they see profit margins. They look at me and see a washed-up old mechanic, an easy mark. They think this is the end of the story, that my humiliation in that office was the final chapter. But my father taught me that you work until the job is done. And my life with Eleanor taught me that you fight for the things you love, no matter the cost. This job isn't done, not by a long shot. Standing there, with Mark's laughter echoing in my ears, I knew what I had to do. This wasn't just about a piece of land anymore. It was about dignity. Hers and mine. They had laughed at the old man, they had disowned Eleanor for loving me, and now they were laughing at me. It was a cycle of scorn, and I was going to be the one to break it. Not with loud words or angry confrontations, but with the one thing I knew best. Patient, steady, hard work. They saw a pile of tetanus. I saw a promise. They saw a crazy old man's folly. I saw my wife's last happy memory. They saw an ending. I knew, deep in my bones, that this was just the beginning. I walked away from that office with their scorn at my back, but for the first time since Eleanor died, I felt a flicker of purpose. The world had written me off, just like it had written off that old submarine. And I was about to show them all what a determined old man with nothing left to lose was capable of. The rust didn't scare me. The ridicule didn't scare me. The only thing that scared me was the thought of failing her, and that was something I was never going to do. The first few days were quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that comes before a storm. The whispers started at the edges of things. I went to the hardware store for some basic supplies. Work gloves, a heavy-duty padlock, some chain. Bill, the owner, who I've known since we were kids, was just a little too friendly. He kept asking if I was all set, his eyes full of a sad, syrupy pity that made my skin crawl. He didn't ask about the scrapyard, not directly, but he didn't have to. As I walked out, the bell over the door jingling behind me, I heard him start talking in a low voice to another customer. I didn't catch the words, but I could feel the shape of them. They were about me. That was the beginning of it, the feeling of being a story someone else was telling behind your back. It didn't take long for the jokes to get a name. I was out in my front yard one afternoon, trying to fix the loose shutter on the window that faces the street, when a car full of teenagers drove by. One of them leaned out the window and yelled, "Ahoy there, Admiral Arthur," before they all burst out laughing and sped off. It stung, but they were just kids. A few days later, though, I was at the diner, and I heard one of the fishermen I've known for 30 years say it to another guy. "Saw Admiral Arthur heading down to his fleet this morning," he said, and they both had a good chuckle over their coffee. It wasn't mean, not really. It was just a joke, a new piece of town folklore. I had become the punchline. The name stuck, and soon it felt like everyone was in on it. Mark, of course, made sure the story had legs. He was a master at that sort of thing, planting seeds of ridicule and watching them grow. I got a call from a second cousin over in the next county, someone I hadn't heard from in a decade. He was just calling to see how I was holding up, after everything. It was a fishing expedition, plain and simple. He asked vague questions about my new project, his voice oozing a false concern that was more insulting than Mark's open contempt. I kept my answers short and polite, but I knew what was happening. Mark and Susan were broadcasting my foolishness to the entire extended family, making sure everyone knew that old Arthur had finally lost his mind, inheriting a pile of rust and calling it a treasure. I was no longer just a widower. I was a spectacle. The change in town was subtle at first, like the tide going out so slowly you don't notice the beach is bigger until you're standing on dry sand where water used to be. People I'd shared a nod with every morning for 40 years would suddenly find something very interesting to look at on the other side of the street when they saw me coming. Old friends from the garage, Guys I'd worked alongside would give me a quick, tight-lipped wave from their trucks but wouldn't stop to chat like they used to. It was the little things that cut the deepest. It wasn't an argument or a confrontation. It was a quiet, collective turning of the back. I was being politely, silently, erased from the daily life of the town I was born in. The space around me grew wider and colder every day. My next trip to the hardware store was different. This time, the joke wasn't behind my back. It was right to my face. I needed some acetylene tanks for a cutting torch, and a set of heavy-duty wrenches, the kind you need for massive, rusted bolts. Bill saw what I was loading onto the counter, and a slow smirk spread across his face. "Planning a voyage, Admiral?" he asked, his voice loud enough for the two other customers in the aisle to hear. They snickered. I just looked at him, my face blank, and paid for my things in cash. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a response. But, as I carried the heavy tanks out to my old truck, I could feel their eyes on me, their amusement hanging in the air like dust. The price of those tools wasn't just the money. It was another piece of my dignity. The offers of help started coming in, each one a little jab wrapped in a neighborly smile. My next-door neighbor, a man who had always been friendly with Mark, came over one afternoon while I was trying to clear a path through the overgrown brush on the property line. He leaned on his fence, chewing on a piece of straw. "You know, Arthur," he said, looking over the mess with a practiced frown, "if you ever decide to just clear this whole junk pile out, I've got a buddy with a bulldozer. Could have it all flattened in a weekend for you, just say the word." He thought he was being clever. His offer wasn't to help me build something. It was an offer to help me surrender, to admit defeat, and tear down the last piece of Eleanor's memory. I just thanked him and said I'd keep it in mind. My social life, what little I had left after Eleanor passed, and I lost my job, evaporated completely. For 20 years I'd been part of a weekly poker game at a buddy's house. It was a simple thing. A few bucks, some bad jokes, and a couple of beers with guys I trusted. After I took possession of the scrapyard, the calls just stopped. No one said I was uninvited. The invitation just never came. The first Friday night it happened, I sat in my quiet house, listening to the clock tick, knowing they were all over there, playing cards, and probably sharing a laugh about Admiral Arthur. It was a profound kind of loneliness, the kind that comes from being deliberately left out. The silence in my house felt like it was shouting at me, telling me I no longer belonged. The scrapyard itself transformed from a private burden into a public landmark of my supposed foolishness. I started the real work, the back-breaking labor, of just trying to get to the submarine. I spent my days wrestling with thorny vines as thick as my arm and hauling away decades of illegally dumped trash. It was slow, grueling work, and people noticed. Cars would slow down as they passed on the coastal road. I'd see people pointing from their windows. Some would even pull over for a moment, just to get a better look at the old fool trying to tame the jungle. I felt like an exhibit, a strange creature in its unnatural habitat. My private act of devotion to my wife had become their free afternoon entertainment, a roadside attraction confirming everything they already believed about me. The financial strain was a constant, grinding pressure. My pension was a joke, barely enough to keep the lights on and put food on the table. The tools and fuel I needed for the scrapyard were eating up what little savings I had left. I swallowed my pride and went to the local bank to ask for a small loan, just a few $1,000s to get some proper equipment. The loan officer was a kid in a suit that was too big for him. He listened patiently, then asked about collateral. I pushed the deed to the scrapyard across the desk. He picked it up, looked at it, and then looked at me with a soft, pitying smile. "Mr. Vance," he said, his voice gentle, "I'm afraid this asset doesn't meet the bank's criteria." He slid the paper back to me. It was another door quietly closed in my face. And then there was the sheer, terrifying scale of the submarine itself. Once I finally cleared a path to it, the reality of what I had taken on hit me like a physical blow. It wasn't just big. It was a monster of decaying iron, a labyrinth of jagged edges and dark, flooded spaces. The rust wasn't just a color, it was a disease that had eaten away at the steel, making every surface treacherous. I'd stand there at the end of the day, my body screaming with exhaustion, and just stare at it, feeling impossibly small. In those moments, their voices would creep into my head. They're right, it's a pile of tetanus. It's a tomb. The physical weight of the task felt inseparable from the emotional weight of their judgment, and some days, both felt like they were going to crush me. One afternoon, I was struggling with a jammed hatch on the deck, pulling on it with a crowbar until my muscles burned, and it wouldn't budge. I slumped down against the cold, rusted metal, defeated. And in that moment of quiet frustration, I remembered one of Eleanor's stories. She told me how her grandfather used to call this very hatch the whale's blowhole, and how she, as a little girl, would pretend it was about to spray water to the sky. I could almost hear her laugh. That memory, so clear and pure, was like a splash of cold water. It cut through the noise of the town's ridicule and reminded me why I was there. This wasn't for them. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was for her. It was a promise. That flicker of her memory gave me the strength to stand up and try again. Just when I thought the town's interest might be fading, the local paper made it official. Tucked away in the back pages, in a little column for local gossip and quirky news, was a short paragraph. It didn't mention my name, but it didn't need to. It talked about Port Blossom's newest naval commander and his unsinkable inheritance on the North Shore. It described the Herculean effort to restore his flagship with a tone of mocking amusement. That little piece of newsprint legitimized the joke. It was no longer just whispers or a nickname. It was a published fact. Now everyone in town, even those who didn't know me personally, had been given permission to laugh. The story was set in stone, and I was its fool. The most painful moments were often the quietest. I ran into Susan at the grocery store. I tried to just nod and move past her, but she made a point of stopping me right in the middle of the canned goods aisle. She didn't insult me. She did something far crueler. She put on a show of profound concern, her voice loud enough for everyone around us to hear. "Arthur, dear," she said, placing a cold hand on my arm. "Are you getting enough to eat? You look so tired. You must let us know if you need anything, really. We're so worried about you being all alone out there with that thing." It was a masterful performance of pity, designed to paint me as a pathetic, senile old man who couldn't take care of himself. I just pulled my arm away gently and walked off, the heat of shame burning my neck. The final realization, the moment I knew it wasn't just a few people but everyone, came at the Port Blossom Diner. It was a Tuesday, my usual night for a hot turkey sandwich. I was sitting in my regular booth when a group of guys I knew came in. Mechanics, fishermen, men I'd considered my peers. They sat at the counter, and their voices carried. They were telling jokes, and I was the subject. They laughed about Admiral Arthur trying to patch holes with chewing gum, about him declaring war on the seagulls. They weren't being hateful. They were just having fun, passing the time. But hearing my struggle, my private promise to my wife, turned into casual entertainment by men I respected, it broke something inside me. In their eyes, I wasn't Arthur Vance anymore. I was just the old fool with the worthless property. The coffee in my cup suddenly tasted like ash. The familiar, comforting clatter of plates and silverware in the diner sounded like nails on a chalkboard. Every laugh felt directed at me, even if it wasn't. I felt completely and utterly alone, a ghost in a place I'd called home my entire life. They couldn't see me, the real me. They only saw the caricature they had created. I couldn't finish my sandwich. I slid out of the booth, left a $10 bill on the table, and walked out into the night air without looking back. I didn't want them to see the look on my face. That night, I understood. Their judgment wasn't a passing storm. It was the new climate, and I was going to have to learn to live in it. After that night at the diner, I retreated. I stopped going into town unless it was absolutely essential. The scrapyard, which had been the source of all the ridicule, ironically became my only refuge. Out there, surrounded by twisted metal and the sound of the wind and waves. There were no whispers, no pitying looks. The rust was honest. The silence was a comfort. It was a harsh, unforgiving place, but it was real. It didn't judge me. My solitude was no longer just a consequence of their actions. It became my shield. I poured every ounce of my energy, my frustration, and my grief into the work. The world had shrunk to the size of that forgotten piece of coastline, and I was its sole inhabitant. There were dark moments. One evening, as the sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and purple, I sat on a pile of scrap metal, looking at the black silhouette of the submarine. I had worked for 12 hours straight and had managed to clear a space no bigger than a small room. It felt hopeless. The sheer scale of the decay, the endless work, the crushing loneliness, it all washed over me. For a few minutes, I let myself believe they were right. I was a crazy old man chasing a ghost, wasting the last years of my life on a pile of junk. The thought was a cold, heavy stone in my gut, and I felt the sting of tears in my eyes for the first time since Eleanor's funeral. But then, as quickly as the despair came, it was replaced by something else. Something hard and cold and solid. Anger. A quiet, burning anger not at them, but for myself. I had let their whispers get inside my head. I had let their laughter make me doubt my own purpose. I stood up, my joints aching, and picked up a heavy wrench. Their disbelief had pushed me into this corner, isolated me, and tried to define me as a fool. Well, they were going to be wrong. This was no longer just about honoring Eleanor. This was about me. It was about proving that a man's worth isn't determined by the opinion of others. Their ridicule had become my fuel. I turned my back on the sunset, faced the dark, silent submarine, and got back to work. The job was a long way from being done. Now, you probably think I was just a stubborn old fool, drowning in grief and trying to hold on to a memory. You probably think I was out there every day, breaking my back under the hot sun, fueled by nothing but a blind promise to my dead wife. That's what Mark thought. It's what the whole town thought. And I let them call me Admiral Arthur. I let them snicker behind their hands. Because every laugh, every pitying look, every condescending piece of advice was a brick in the wall I was building around my secret. The truth is, my humiliation in that clerk's office wasn't the end of a story. It was the careful, deliberate, and necessary beginning of mine. They were all playing checkers, moving their pieces around in the open. I was playing a different game entirely, one they couldn't even see. You see, this wasn't about luck. It wasn't about me stumbling onto some forgotten treasure by accident. I knew. Not everything, not the specifics, but I knew there was something more to that submarine than rust and seawater. Eleanor had given me the key years before she got sick. After her grandfather died, her family had cleared out his small house with cold efficiency, throwing most of his life into a dumpster. But Eleanor had saved one small leather-bound journal. She gave it to me, saying, "My grandfather wasn't crazy, Arthur. He was just listening to a different story. Keep this for me. Keep it safe." I tucked it away in our old toolbox, and for years that's where it stayed, a forgotten promise wrapped in oily rags. After Eleanor passed, and the silence in the house became too much to bear, I found that journal again. I spent nights reading it by the light of a single lamp. Most of it was just the ramblings of an old man. Notes on tides, sketches of seabirds, complaints about the government. But there were a few entries, right at the end, that made the hair on my arms stand up. He wrote about the submarine, which he'd bought as scrap from the Navy after they dragged it out of the deep water years after the war. He wrote that it was impossibly heavy for its class. He mentioned a section in the engineering bay that was deaf, a place where the steel didn't ring true when he struck it with a hammer. He tried to get into it, but his tools were too old, his body too frail. He wrote one line that I must have read 100 times. She holds a secret in her belly, a heavy one, Not a soul on this earth believes me, but the iron knows. That was it. That was the seed. It wasn't a treasure map, just a whisper from the past. But it was a whisper from the man Eleanor had loved, the man her family had called a fool. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I had to find out what that secret was. My fight with Mark and Susan over the will wasn't just about preserving a memory. It was about protecting a possibility. They wanted to bulldoze the land, tear the submarine apart for scrap. They would have destroyed that secret without ever even knowing it was there, and a part of Eleanor's grandfather's story, and hers, would have been lost forever. So when Mark stood in that office, laughing about my pile of tetanus, I didn't feel shame. I felt a cold, quiet thrill. His arrogance was my greatest asset. The town's ridicule was my camouflage. Who would ever suspect that the broken-down old mechanic, the town joke, was meticulously planning a salvage operation? Every day I went out there, covered in grease and dirt. They saw a man losing his mind. I saw a man getting closer to the truth. Every swing of the sledgehammer, every rusted bolt I broke free, was a calculated step. I wasn't just clearing brush. I was searching for the place the old man had called death, the spot where the iron didn't ring true. The work was hard, yes, but it wasn't hopeless. It was purposeful. It took me weeks of back-breaking labor just to get inside the engineering section. The lower levels were flooded with a thick, foul-smelling sludge of seawater and oil that had been sitting there for 50 years. I had to pump it out by hand with a cheap, gas-powered pump that broke down every other hour. I worked in the dark, with only a headlamp cutting through the gloom, the air thick with the smell of decay. I spent days tapping on bulkheads, listening for that one dull thud amidst the hollow ringing of the old steel. I was starting to lose hope, thinking maybe the old man really had just been crazy. Then, one afternoon, behind a tangle of corroded pipes and wiring, I found it. A small section of the hull that felt dead when I struck it. It didn't ring, it just absorbed the sound. It wasn't a door or a hatch. It was a welded plate, covered in so much rust it looked like part of the original structure. It took me 2 full days with a cutting torch and a crowbar to get it open. The noise was deafening inside that metal tomb, and the air filled with acrid smoke. When the plate finally gave way with a groan of tortured metal, it revealed a small, dark space behind it, no bigger than a closet. A watertight compartment. The air that rushed out was stale but dry. It smelled of old canvas and metal, untouched by the decades of rot that had consumed the rest of the vessel. And inside, stacked neatly on a small metal shelf, were several heavy lead-lined crates. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it was going to come right out of my chest. I pried open the first crate with the end of my crowbar. My hands were shaking. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness and landed on something that didn't seem real. It was a bar of soft, yellow metal. Gold. Stacked neatly, one on top of the other. I opened another crate. More gold. The third crate was different. It was filled with thick, oilcloth-wrapped packages. I carefully unwrapped one and found stacks of old bearer bonds, paper certificates from the 1940s. The last few crates held velvet pouches, heavy and clinking. Inside were diamonds, emeralds, and a handful of what looked like priceless historical artifacts, jeweled daggers, ancient-looking medallions. It was the plunder of a desperate man, a rogue U-boat captain's secret retirement fund, lost to the world for over half a century. I sat there in the dark, surrounded by a fortune I couldn't even comprehend, and I didn't feel joy. I felt a profound, bone-deep sense of peace. It was vindication, not for me, but for Eleanor, for her grandfather. The world had called him crazy, but he was right all along. He knew. He just couldn't get to it. In that moment, I wasn't Admiral Arthur, the town fool. I was the keeper of a secret, the executor of a silent will that had been waiting patiently at the bottom of the ocean. I carefully sealed the compartment back up, making it look like I had never been there. The secret was safe. Now, the real work could begin. The work of doing right by Eleanor's memory. Getting that treasure out and finding out its true worth was the most difficult part. I couldn't just walk into a bank with a bar of gold. I'm a mechanic, not some kind of international smuggler. I spent weeks in the local library, using their computers to research how these things were done. I learned about trusts, about discrete appraisers, about asset liquidation. I felt like I was learning a whole new language. I finally found a specialized law firm out of state, one that dealt with unique assets and valued privacy above all else. I made a phone call from a payphone 2 towns over, my voice nervous, explaining my, quote, unique inheritance situation in the vaguest terms possible. They must have thought I was a crank, but something in my voice must have convinced them. They sent a man, a quiet, professional appraiser who looked more like a history professor than a treasure hunter. He came in the middle of the night, in an unmarked van. He didn't ask questions about where it came from. His only job was to determine what it was and what it was worth. We spent 6 hours in the belly of that submarine, his instruments clicking and whirring. I watched his face as he examined each piece, his professional calm, slowly giving way to visible astonishment. He was meticulous, testing the purity of the gold, examining the watermarks on the bonds, studying the cut of the jewels under a loupe. He spoke very little, just making notes in a small black book. The silence was heavier than any of the crates we had opened. When he was done, we sat in my old truck, the first light of dawn breaking over the water. He took a deep breath, looked at his notes, and then looked at me. "Mr. Vance," he said, his voice steady but with an edge of awe, "I have appraised assets on 5 continents for 30 years. I have never seen anything like this. The gold bullion alone is substantial. The bonds, while old, are still valid and have accrued significant interest. The artifacts are museum quality." He paused, and I held my breath. "Conservatively," he said, "after accounting for commissions and legal fees for liquidation, the total value of the contents of that compartment is $188 million. He said the number like it was the time of day. 188 million. I just nodded slowly. I didn't gasp. I didn't shout. The number was so big it didn't even feel real. It was just a sound. What felt real was the weight of it, the responsibility. This wasn't lottery money. This was something else. This was history. It was Eleanor's legacy. It was the punchline to a joke that had been 50 years in the making. The appraiser explained the next steps, how the law firm would create an anonymous trust for me, how they would handle the liquidation in a way that drew no attention, how the money would be made clean and legal. It was a world I knew nothing about, but I understood the most important part. No one would ever have to know. The secret would remain mine. So, for months, while the town laughed, I was the richest man in Port Blossom. I was probably one of the richest men in the state. I still wore my old work clothes, still drove my beat-up truck, still ate my Tuesday night special at the diner, though I started sitting in a booth in the back just to listen. I'd hear them joking about Admiral Arthur trying to sell scrap metal by the pound, and I'd just sip my coffee. The feeling was indescribable. It was a quiet, unshakable power. They saw a pathetic old man, a failure. They had no idea that I could buy and sell every one of them 10 times over. I could have bought the diner right out from under them and fired the lot of them. But that wasn't the point. That was Mark's kind of power. Loud, arrogant, built on humiliating others. My power was different. It was silent. It was patient. This money wasn't for me. I've lived my whole life on a mechanic's salary. I don't need a mansion or a fancy car. This money was a tool, just like a wrench or a blowtorch. It was a tool to be used for a specific job. And the job was to build something beautiful and permanent in Eleanor's name, something that would honor the kind, gentle woman she was. And in the process, if that tool also happened to dismantle the arrogant world Mark and Susan had built for themselves, well, that was just a matter of good, solid engineering. They had underestimated me my entire life. They looked at my calloused hands and saw a simple mind. They heard my quiet way of speaking and assumed I had nothing to say. They saw me grieving my wife and decided I was weak and lost. They never once considered that a man who spent 40 years listening to the subtle language of engines might also be good at listening to the world, at seeing the things that lie hidden beneath the surface. They laughed at the rust, but they never bothered to look at the steel underneath. And that was their mistake. A fatal one. Because while they were all laughing, I was making a plan. A quiet, careful, and absolutely definitive plan. And it was almost time to turn the key. The money changed nothing about me, but it changed everything about what I could do. For a few weeks, I did nothing at all. I just let the reality of it settle in my bones. I wasn't a rich man. I was a custodian. This wasn't my fortune. It was Eleanor's legacy. I thought about Mark and Susan, about their smug faces in that office, and for a fleeting moment, I felt the temptation of revenge. I could have bought the bank they owed money to, driven them into the ground, made them feel as small as they had made me feel. But then I'd hear Eleanor's voice in my head, gentle and clear, and I knew that wasn't the answer. Her memory deserved to be honored with creation, not destruction. My plan, when it finally formed, wasn't about vengeance. It was about building a better silence. It was about ensuring that the last thing people thought of when they heard the Vance name wasn't a rusty submarine, but something beautiful and enduring. My dignity didn't need their apology. It just needed a quiet place to live out its days in peace. My first call was to the law firm. I instructed them to set up an anonymous donation through the trust. The town of Port Blossom, my home, the place that had whispered behind my back, was struggling. Young people were leaving because there were no opportunities. So I gave them one. A multi-million-dollar gift to build a new community and vocational center, right on the old, abandoned fish packing grounds. A place where kids could learn a trade, learn to work with their hands like I did, and where old folks could have a warm place to gather. There was only one condition, a non-negotiable one. The building was to be named the Eleanor Vance Center. The news hit the town like a tidal wave. No one knew where the money came from. They just knew that the name of the woman they'd all but forgotten was now going to be carved in stone on the most hopeful building Port Blossom had seen in 50 years. I read about it in the paper, sitting in my old truck, and I smiled. It was a good start. The second part of the plan was more personal. I knew Mark and Susan's grand condo project was their whole world. I also knew it depended entirely on them acquiring all the small, undeveloped waterfront parcels that bordered my scrapyard. So quietly, through the trust, I started buying them. My lawyers, acting for a nameless corporation, made offers the local owners couldn't refuse. One by one, the little plots of land that made up Mark's future empire became mine. He never saw it coming. He was so focused on trying to pressure me into selling my worthless plot that he didn't even notice the ground being bought right out from under him. There was a quiet, clean satisfaction in it, like tightening the final bolt on a perfectly rebuilt engine. I wasn't destroying his dream out of spite. I was simply protecting the coastline that Eleanor had loved, ensuring it would never be blocked by glass towers and private marinas. The final parcel I bought was the one right next to his office. With the land secured, it was time for the final move. The salvage company I hired came in, and the official story was that I was finally doing the responsible thing and having the hazardous old submarine dismantled for environmental safety. The town nodded along, thinking old Admiral Arthur had finally come to his senses. During that process, my real treasure was discreetly removed in the dead of night. Once the land was cleared and certified clean, I made my last move. I took all the parcels I had bought, including the original scrapyard, and donated the entire stretch of coastline to a state conservation trust. The deed stipulated that it was to be turned into a permanent nature preserve, never to be developed, a place for birds and wild beach roses to live undisturbed. A small, simple bronze plaque was placed at the entrance to the new walking trail. It just said, "The Eleanor Vance Coastal Preserve. In loving memory." I never said a word to Mark or Susan. I didn't have to. Their project was dead, suffocated by a wall of protected wilderness. I heard they lost everything, that their investors pulled out, and they had to sell their big house. Sometimes I see them in town. They look older, beaten. They know it was me, somehow, but they can't prove it, and the not knowing seems to eat at them more than anything else. They are haunted by a ghost they can't fight. I still live in my little house. I still drive my old truck. But now, when I drive through town, I pass the Eleanor Vance Center, buzzing with life. And when I want to feel close to her, I walk the trails of the Eleanor Vance Coastal Preserve and watch the waves roll in. They laughed at me for inheriting a pile of rust. They were wrong. I inherited a legacy, and I learned that true justice isn't a loud explosion. It's a quiet, unshakable foundation built right where everyone else only saw ruin.